So we started looking at workers' compensation, and Lloyd Harger from the Division of Workers' Compensation pretty much defined it, and you can see the definition that he had here. But simply put, if I can get that out right, is that workers' compensation, if an employee is hurt on the job and it's determined that it is work-related, an employer has workers' compensation insurance to cover the costs of medical costs and some other costs that are regarding this, and the employee is not charged for this. And so if you've seen anything or heard anything at work about this, or hopefully they're talking to you, workers' compensation is free to you as an employee, and if you are hurt, you don't need to go to the doctor on your own. And what I've found is several times in talking about this face to face, employees don't understand this, or students don't understand this as employees, and so it is something that you do need to understand. Now, when you start looking at the timeline of workers' compensation, it kind of looks a lot like what we've discussed before. So it goes back to before 2000s BC, and then it kind of progressively goes up to the pressure workers, and they're the ones who actually first received workers' compensation, and this was for railroad workers. And then when the Pennsylvania Mine Act, the Safety Act, was passed into law, it had a provision for workers' compensation as well. In 1877, Massachusetts, the one who actually passed a safeguarding law, and then you start seeing in German workers in 1884 the workers' compensation was put into play, and then it goes into Maryland and then 30 states. And then with the OSHA Act in 1970, it did have a whole implication with regard to workers' compensation. Workers' compensation used to be called workmen's compensation, but they changed that to workers' compensation. So when you're actually looking at workers' compensation and why you would need that, with regard to it, it's considered like a no-fault insurance. And so an employee, when they are injured, it can be their fault. And we've talked about this with regard to accidents and how a lot of times it is unsafe acts that cause some type of accident. But essentially what we look at from the workers' compensation point of view is that they were injured at work and we need to take care of them. And you can see here this guy is on this ladder trying to trim these leaves here, and he's pretty stable on that one ladder, but obviously it wasn't tall enough, so he put a 6-foot ladder upon that. Looks like something, a 20-foot ladder or higher, and or excuse me, lower, and it made him go a little bit higher. Now the guy down below, he's being pretty safe by holding on to it. But if you think about it, if this guy falls off this ladder, hits the other guy, both of them are going to need medical treatment. And even though this guy is doing a major unsafe act, as you can see, it's probably something that was going to be covered under workers' compensation. Now, when you start looking at common law, previously employees had to sue under civil law, and this was eliminated after workers' comp laws came into effect. So you can see here the assumption of risk. This is what it used to be, that employees actually assumed the risk when they accepted the job. So if you were a firefighter, you assumed that yes, you may get into a burning building and you may be killed by fire. Also, too, they looked at contributory negligence. And what they said was that an employee contributed to their injury. And as I mentioned previously with the unsafe acts in the accident investigation, that's where most of those are caused from. And so they're saying that yes, the employees did contribute to their injury. And then the last one is that other employees might have contributed to this. And this is where you started looking at before workers' compensation came into play. And so it wasn't very fair to employees, often sided with employers. So then you start looking at exclusive remedy, and this is when when workers' compensation actually goes into effect, employers were saying, okay, if you get workers' compensation, then you agree that you're not going to sue us for anything else. And that was a pretty good plan, actually, because you're saying, okay, you're accepting this money, you're saying that this is okay, we're in agreement with this. And obviously, there was some type of exception for that, and this was like for major safety violations or deliberate assaults. But it seemed to be working out fairly well when it was this way because it was fair to the employee as well as fair to the employer. But that doesn't seem to be happening, and what you see is that a lot of people refuse to take that, or they don't want to accept that, and they want to go for the big money with regard to it. And so what they're doing is they're actually bypassing it, and employers are getting sued. So if the employee wins, then the workers' compensation, they do have to repay those benefits, but they also normally get a bigger payout. So the employees, when they do file a workers' compensation claim, everything's paid for initially. They're not out any money, and they can go ahead and apply for the bigger gain. They don't have any out-of-pocket expenses at the beginning. But this liability can be more expensive, and then you start looking at on a company standpoint, your pain and suffering and the sympathetic juries with regard to this. So how do you control the payment? And that's one of the biggest things that you start looking at. Typically, there's a waiting period of 3 to 14 days. In the state of Oklahoma, it's 3 days, and in Kansas and Missouri, it's 7 days. And what it is as the day that the employee is injured, you count 7 days from that, and then the employee will get 66% of their wages. Or some states actually have a cap. It just kind of depends. And the waiting days are essentially per state. And so as you can see, the three that I mentioned, they're different, but it just depends on what that each state is. When you start looking at also too, some states have a period of time and a maximum amount of money that's set on that. It just kind of depends from state to state what that is. Okay, so returning to work program, this is where you want to get the employees back to work as soon as possible. Now, they may not be able to do their job, but they could be doing maybe somebody else's job. And so, maybe someone fell and broke their foot, as we can see here with the cast. And so, obviously, the person's not going to be able to stand and work on the machine that he used to all the time. And so maybe they come into the office and do some filing, or maybe they help with some paperwork in the maintenance shop. And so what you're trying to do is get them back to work as soon as possible. Now, studies have actually shown that people who return to work sooner do tend to, not file claims against companies, or they tend to save the company money one way or the other. And so, you're just kind of letting the employee get back to work, but get back into the mode of work versus sitting at home and watching Oprah reruns or whatever else that they're watching. So there's different types of injuries, and we'll look at these because there's a ton of different terminology, which you'll probably need to know on this. But when you look at total and then you look at partial, obviously total is unable to perform any type of duties with regard to it, and then partial is able to perform some of the duties, or they can't perform all of the duties like they used to, so they can only perform some. There's some different terminology. The temporary total disability that is down here, both of these and the temporary partial disability, the employee is expected to recover. So your your temporary total disability, it does prevent the employee from working, but it's only going to be for a limited time. So the employee can't work now, but will be able to. And this is where most of the cases of workers' compensation disabilities fall under. Then you have a temporary partial disability, and this actually prevents the employee from doing the job for a limited period of time, or maybe they can do parts of their job but not all of their job. The next one is going to be permanent total disability, and this is something that the employee will not come back to work, and they're not totally helpless, and this is what needs to be understood, or medically incapacitated, but they're just able to unwork at their job or one that's very similar. And then the permanent partial disability, it partially impairs the employee's ability to work. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to mention here too, is that there is some retraining incentive benefits that are kind of in the workers' compensation and I don't have down here. But essentially, if a person is permanent total disability or permanent partial disability, a lot of times companies will have these retraining incentive benefits, which will allow the employee to go back to school and maybe learn something different so that they can integrate them back into the system versus the permanency of that. And then there's also a survivor's benefit that's a clause up underneath the workers' compensation, and this obviously is when someone has died, and the survivors will receive some money for that. All of these are kind of listed under schedules, and it depends on what body part and or what body parts that has been disabled. And these are set by the Insurance Institute, and so it's not something that I have at this information. But if you do lose like a finger, it may be worth something. If it's your thumb, it may be worth more than your pinky, and your index finger may be worth more than your ring finger. It just kind of depends on how those schedules are set up. Okay, so who's covered in Kansas? Well, when you start looking at it, and this is where it starts to get a little bit fuzzy of who actually that is, but you're actually looking at an employee or a worker is any person who works under any type of contract. And when you go in and you apply for a job, typically you're going to sign some type of contract with an employer. And these can be full-time, part-time, it can be seasonal, minors, anybody who's actually working for the job. But when you start looking at it, and this is the critical test, is what control does the employer exercise over the worker? Now this falls into play, does a temporary worker fall under the workers' compensation for this? Now the temporary worker actually works for an employment agency, and your company has actually hired this temporary employee, and the employee is actually controlled by the employer, meaning the employer who gives them direction, but the person who signs their checks is the employment agency. And so it gets a little bit fuzzy about who's actually covering what on this. Now, typically what happens is the employment agency who employs the temporary employee, they're the ones who are going to be providing the workers' compensation for this employee. And so the employer, meaning the company that you work for, they're not going to be providing that, but then again, they still have to do all of the accident investigation, and then they also have to do any type of corrective action. They do need to report back to the temporary employee's company that they work for. So it does get a little bit confusing, but there's really defined lines with regards to that. Okay, who's not covered in Kansas? And these are some areas that you look at it. Certain agricultural pursuits, realtors, employers with $20,000 or less in annual payrolls, firefighters because they actually belong to a different relief association that they have workers' compensation on, sole proprietors and partners, and then owner-operated drivers. All of those are not covered under Kansas, and this is under the Kansas statutes. Now the premiums, when you start looking at this, and this is where it comes into money for the employer, how much money are you actually going to pay for this? And so what I've listed here is there's actually a SIC code. It's a standard industrial classification, and a NAICS code, which is a North American industry classification system. And each one of these systems have specific numbers that are down there. When you start looking at, let's just take restaurants, there's like a full service restaurant, and the NAICS code on that is 722110, and then the fast food restaurant or the carry-out restaurant is 722111. But the SIC code is the same for both of those. It's 5812. But then under the full service, you do exclude donut and bagel shops, which is 5461. So it's very defined about which area you're going to be under. So what they actually do when you look at the insurance calculations is they take the total amount of payroll and then times 100, divided by 100 times their rate. And that insurance rate is actually set by another company. Okay, this National Council on Compensation Insurance, they're the ones who actually look at the numbers. And a lot of the companies actually, or excuse me, a lot of the states actually use this council, the NCCI. And what it does is it looks at a lot of different factors with regard to modification rates, and that's that rate, that 100 times whatever rate that's going to be. And so they look at industry, and so the rate for an industry, let's say your fast food carry-out restaurants, they have a specific rate. Now compared to a construction company, their rate's probably going to be a lot lower than a construction company's, and it just kind of depends on the industry itself. And so what it looks at industry average, and then what is the size of the payroll, and then what is your independent company's losses. You know, how many losses or how many workers' compensation cases have you had in such a long period of time? The NCCEI also not only looks at industry trends, but then it looks at recommendations. And so they're the ones, obviously, as I mentioned before, that do those rates. And then they look at proposed legislation with regard to it. And so they are looking out for companies and looking out for insurance companies as well. Now, the experience modification, or the mod rate, is kind of what we're looking at, and it's usually looking at a 3-year loss period of time. And so they'll go back 3 years and say, okay, they have had this many accidents and this much a loss was accompanied with that. So it's going to be a dollar figure when it looks at that. And then it's recalculated annually. And so what they do is, let's say that 4 years ago we had a total loss of $100,000. Well, this year when they recalculate it, they're only going to be looking at a total loss for those 3 years now, maybe $75,000. So it's going to be less than it was the year before. And so what they do is they'll look at like a particular area or a SIC code that we talked about earlier. For example, fast food carryout and full service carryout have the same SIC code. And so we'll say, okay, this is all over industry, exactly how much this should be. The average ends up becoming 1. And so what they do is then take whatever that mod rate is and then times it by the manual premium, and this becomes the standard premium. So let's say that a company has had quite a few losses and their average is 2.5, and this is where it comes into a little bit of figuring out. But if their mod rate is 2.5 and they paid a manual premium of and I'm just going to use a figure here of $1,000, and that's probably not going to be true, but we're just going to use it for safe sake here. Then their premium is normally, if their mod rate is 2.5 and their manual premium is 1,000, then their standard premium is going to be 2,500 is what that would be. And so it ends up saying, okay, well, this is what you're going to pay. Now, if we go back and say, okay, well, they're under the average, meaning that they didn't have, they were below the average of whatever it is, and let's say that they have like a 0.5 and they have a $1,000 premium, then it's going to be a lot less. It's only going to be $500 is what their standard premium is going to cost. So I know this is a little bit confusing, but it is something for you to kind of know the information about, especially if you're wanting to be a manager or an employer of a company. This describes it, and this is what I was trying to tell you just a second ago. I forgot that I had this slide on here. But let's say that a insurance company charges $1.20 per every 100 employees, $100 of a payroll. And so you have $1 million of payroll and office workers. And so what you're doing is you're actually taking the 1 million, dividing it by 100, and then multiplying it by 1.2, which is $12,000. And so if your rate is cheaper than the 1, which would be 0.85, then your premium would be less. Or if it's over it, it's going to be higher. And so just kind of trying to give you two different views of where it might be. And there is a question on this test, so make sure if you have any questions that you do ask. But it's just kind of common sense. If it's over 1 and it is larger than what it was the year before, then your premium is going to be higher. If it is over 1, or it could be under 1 too, but if it's over or under 1 and it's less, your mod rate is less than it was the year before, then obviously your premium is going to be less than it was the previous year. Okay, so a lot of companies, what they do is they try to self-insure, and what this means essentially is that you say, we're pretty much good for it. We can take care of the money that it would cost for workers' compensation. And so what typically happens is that you put up a bond or some type of security, and you put all the money into this one account. And then as the bills come in, the company receives the bill and they go ahead and pay it themselves versus running it through a workers' compensation insurance company. And so a lot of times you do see companies do this. It is obviously riskier, but it does lower the costs because you don't have all those administrative costs that runs with the other programs. And it just depends on company whether they can do that or not, whether they're self-insured. Now there's a lot of different problems with workers' compensation, and I know that you probably understand this, but there's a ton of abuse with the system. And what happens is that you really need to look out for any type of fairness, and that's the whole problem is. And we've all seen or known somebody who's had workers' compensation and probably didn't really receive it or need to receive it, and it's just costing you as another employee of that company more money. On here is a link that you can go to that's for fraud cases, and feel free to go into that, but it kind of describes some of the fraud cases that are out there. Obviously there's tons and tons more. So when to looking at as a company or as a safety manager or manager, could this be potential fraud? These are some things that kind of raise red flags when it comes to safety managers or people investigating the accident. Okay, typically if there's a ton of people around the employee who has had an accident, but for some strange reason this one time there was no witnesses, that's kind of a strange incident. The person actually has a history of filing claims. They've done it more than once. We had an employee that when I worked with them, they had like 6 or 7 claims, and so that starts raising a red flag as well. If the injury occurs during some type of off-season hunting or softball or some other type of seasonal thing like that, especially if it occurs on a Monday and the person's done something, or the day after a game, or the day after a person goes out and plays or hunts or something like that, that normally will raise a red flag. And then too, if there's some type of inaccuracy in the doctor's reports, maybe you have got one report from the employee and the employee's telling you one thing, and then they go to the doctor and they say something different. Obviously something you need to look at. If they start looking for the compensation demands are excessive, and they say no, I want $10,000 when the compensation's only $5,000, obviously there may be some red flags with that. The person actually who's filing a claim has a side job, or they're doing something that at home, and then you see that they come in and actually file a claim. That could be potentially something. So P.O. boxes, obviously, and then there's really no basis for the accident, and that's come across a few times as well. So not is one of these just one of them that you need to hang your hat on and say, oops, that person's filing fraud, but you can really get a feel from a person, especially after you do several accident investigations and you're talking to the people and you see maybe the way they say things, or if they're having difficulty describing things, or if in their maybe you talk to them more than once or even during one conversation and they keep changing their story. Any of these that are listed here, as well as those, are something that kind of raises a red flag, and you just need to look at it. So when we start looking at what the future of workers' compensation is, and there obviously needs to be some reform to this. These are some of the California is actually leading the way on this, and these are some of the things that they're doing. And it's kind of interesting because if you've ever filed a workers' compensation claim and had to go to court, it's very interesting to sit in as an employer, and you can definitely tell the employers from the employees that are sitting there at the courthouse, and the attorneys are saying, now if they ask you this, this is what you need to say. And so it's really become a really I don't want to say untruthful situation. And workers' compensation was really meant to compensate employees fairly for injuries, and it's really become a big game or a chess game that employees, employers, and their attorneys are playing. So obviously there does need to be quite a bit of reform with regard to this. So how do you actually reduce any type of workers' compensation? Well, there's several ways. There's three of them listed here. Making sure that you actually stay in touch with the employee at all times. Making sure that they have to bring in information to you or come in and see you every once in a while, or if you need to, go see them, depending on the severity of their injury. But keeping that communication open and really talking to the employee and seeing what their feelings are, and how they're adjusting to, being disabled or having some type of injury, disablement. Those are things that you as an employer want to do. You do want to make sure that you determine the cause of the accident, which we talked about previously, and then get them back to work as soon as possible. As I said previously, the studies show that if an employee does come back to work earlier, they seem to integrate a little bit better, and they don't stay at home, and it does reduce a lot of the costs that are associated with it. These are 8 steps to lowering premiums. Obviously, you want to have a really, really good safety program to prevent any type of accidents that may occur, and then to manage your medical costs. Now, if you've been to the emergency room lately, it costs about $2,000 for a cut, whereas if you go to a doctor, it may only cost you, $100, $150 for the cut to be sewn up. And so trying to manage those costs and trying to kind of help assist with that will definitely lower some premiums because you don't have as much costs on your books. Your return to work program, we've talked about that. Looking at insurance providers and who you might be able to find out there, because they do have different premiums, and it seems like some companies work better with other companies. Making sure that you are investigating all workplace accidents, and then managing the injured employee, making sure you're calling them, keeping in touch with them, letting them know the information. Communication is the key, as I said previously. I'm looking at fraud and trying to manage that, whether it be by hiring a private investigator or actually doing some information on that. And then finally, just preventing litigation, because that's when your costs get really high with regards to that, and it's something you need to look at. So some specific strategies that you might want to do, and this kind of falls back into looking at some of those behavior based or some of those theories we talked about in accident investigation, is really making safety a part of the culture and not just doing it as something that the safety manager or the managers do. Cultivating the job satisfaction between employees and making them want to come back to work is definitely going to help out with workers' compensation. You might want to look at a cost reduction program, maybe reducing the number of accidents and how you can do that, really doing a lot of corrective action or preventative actions prior to people getting into accidents, and then totally integrating it into your managed care. You're doing some wellness programs along with your regular health care. All of those things will help you. So hopefully you've understood the majority of this. I know workers' compensation is a little bit difficult, but as a manager or a safety manager or a company owner, this is definitely something that you need to understand, as it does reflect upon you and the companies that your costs have. Thank you.